My sister and I were supposed to cross the same graduation stage, but my parents made it clear only one of us mattered. They handed her a massive check and slid the lunch bill to me. They looked me dead in the eye and told me she had potential and I did not. They had absolutely no idea I was about to walk onto that stage as the person who secretly owned the empire they were betting their lives on. I am Diana, 32 years old, and for my entire life, I was the invisible daughter. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been pushed aside by the people who were supposed to love you the most. We were seated in a private alcove at an expensive Chicago restaurant. In exactly 2 hours, both my younger sister Sydney and I were scheduled to receive our Master of Business Administration degrees. We had both completed the program, but the atmosphere made you think I was merely a hired guest brought to fill an empty chair. I sat quietly at the edge of the plush booth, wearing a tailored suit I had bought with my own money. Across from me sat my mother Patricia, radiating suburban arrogance. Next to her was my father Harold, projecting the image of a wealthy patriarch. And then there was Sydney, my 30-year-old sister. Sydney was the golden child, the undisputed center of my parents' universe. She sat there glowing with unearned confidence. For 5 years I had worked 80-hour weeks running on fumes. I paid every cent of my tuition, sacrificing sleep and peace of mind. I built my life in the shadows while my family showered Sydney with endless financial backing. Today was the culmination of those sleepless nights. But as the waiters cleared our plates, my mother decided to make her priorities undeniable. Patricia picked up her spoon and gently tapped it against her champagne flute. The delicate ringing sound cut through the ambient noise. Harold immediately sat up straighter. Sydney adjusted her posture, adopting an expression of practiced modesty. "I want to propose a toast," Patricia announced, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness she reserved for public performances. "To our brilliant Sydney. Today you are graduating at the absolute top of your class. We have watched you work incredibly hard. You have always been the star of this family, destined for true greatness. Your father and I could not be more proud of the executive career you are about to launch." She raised her glass, and Harold eagerly mirrored the gesture. I raised my water glass, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. Not once during her speech did Patricia even glance in my direction. Not once did she acknowledge that I was also receiving my degree today. It was as if I was completely invisible, entirely erased from the family narrative. But the toast was only the beginning. Patricia reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp white envelope. She handed it across the table to Sydney with a flourish. "Your father and I wanted to give you something to help start this amazing new chapter," Patricia said. "We know you will be needing a proper home now that you are moving up in the corporate world." Sydney tore open the envelope and let out a squeal that caused several patrons to turn and stare. "Oh my gosh, Mom! Dad, this is amazing!" She held up a cashier's check for everyone to see. It was written out for $100,000. A down payment for a house. My parents were handing her a fortune while ignoring my presence. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, but I quickly shoved it down. I had learned that seeking validation from these people was a losing game. As Sydney gushed over the money-making loud plans, the waiter approached our table. He carried a sleek black leather folder containing the bill for our extravagant lunch. He hesitated, unsure of who should receive it. Harold was deep in conversation with Sydney, and Patricia was busy admiring her favorite daughter. Patricia noticed the waiter and gave him a brief, dismissive smile. She reached out, took the leather folder, and without even opening it, slid it directly across the white tablecloth. It stopped right in front of me. I looked down at the folder and then up at my mother. The total, I knew, was astronomical given the vintage champagne and premium steaks my family had ordered. "Diana, you cover this," Patricia stated coldly, her voice devoid of any warmth. Her words were sharp, designed to cut and humiliate. "We drained our savings 5 years ago, paying $150,000 for Sydney's tuition. She has potential, you do not. It is time you pay us back for everything we have done for you." The silence that followed was suffocating. The waiter stood awkwardly near the edge of our booth, his eyes darting to the floor, clearly mortified by the blatant cruelty he had just witnessed. Sydney smirked, tucking her $100,000 check safely into her purse. Harold did not even bother to look my way, taking another sip of his expensive wine. I sat completely still, staring at the black leather folder resting on the table. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I let the heavy silence stretch out, wrapping around the table. I locked eyes with my mother, holding her cold gaze with my own. She expected me to crumble, to feel small and worthless, like I always did when we were younger. She thought she was putting me in my place, cementing my role as the ultimate family disappointment forever. She had absolutely no idea about the massive and destructive storm that was just about to hit her and completely change her life forever. The suffocating silence stretched across our private dining alcove, broken only by the clinking of silverware from nearby tables. I kept my eyes locked on my mother, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. Next to Sydney, Terrence shifted uncomfortably in his seat. At 32 years old, he was a dedicated African-American high school history teacher. He was hardworking, patient, and entirely too kind for the viper pit he had married into. I watched the mortification spread across his face. He knew exactly how wrong this was. He reached into his blazer and pulled out his worn leather wallet. "Please," Patricia Terrence said, his deep voice steady but strained. "Let me take care of this. It is a celebration after all. Diana should not have to pay for our lunch." He began to slide a credit card from his wallet, but before he could even place it on the table, Sydney lunged forward. She smacked his hand away with a sharp, aggressive slap that echoed in the quiet space. The waiter actually jumped backward. "What on earth are you doing?" Sydney hissed, her perfect smile contorting into a vicious sneer. "Put that away right now. Your meager teacher salary can barely cover the minimum payments on my credit cards. You cannot afford a $1,200 lunch, Terrence." Terrence froze, his jaw clenching tight. A flash of profound humiliation crossed his eyes, but he swallowed it down, retreating back into his chair. He looked down at his lap, completely defeated by his own wife in front of everyone. Sydney let out a dismissive scoff and waved her hand toward me. "Seriously, Terrence, let Diana pay. She is used to living like a peasant anyway. $1,000 is probably her entire life savings, but it will teach her some responsibility. Besides, she owes Mom and Dad for being such a financial drain all these years." I looked at Sydney, then at Terrence, and finally at my parents, who were nodding along as if Sydney had just delivered a brilliant business strategy. They thought they had me cornered. They thought they were punishing me. Instead of crying, I smiled. It was a serene, calm smile that clearly unnerved my mother. I reached into my purse and bypassed the standard bank cards I used for everyday purchases. My fingers brushed against the cool, heavy metal of the card I reserved for major corporate expenses. I pulled out my American Express Centurion Black card. I did not hand it directly to the waiter. Instead, I tossed it onto the center of the table. Because it was made of solid anodized titanium, it hit the wood with a loud, heavy thud that sounded like a dropped coin. The waiter, a seasoned professional at this high-end Chicago establishment, recognized it instantly. His eyes widened slightly, and his posture immediately shifted from awkward bystander to utmost deference. He knew exactly what that card meant. He knew the initiation fee alone cost more than most cars, and that there was no spending limit. "Right away, madam," the waiter said respectfully, scooping up the heavy metal card. He gave me a slight bow before turning on his heel and walking briskly toward the payment station. My family, however, remained completely oblivious. They lived in a world of suburban status symbols, leased luxury cars, and country club memberships they could barely afford. They had never moved in the circles where a true black card existed. To them, it was just a piece of black plastic. "Is that a prepaid debit card?" my father Harold asked with a mocking chuckle. "I hope you actually put enough money on it to cover the bill, Diana. It would be incredibly embarrassing if it declined." "Oh, let her try." Dad, Sydney laughed, taking a sip of her champagne. "If it bounces, Terrence can chip in his grocery money for the week." I sat back in my plush chair, folding my hands in my lap. The absolute ignorance radiating from my family was almost comical. They genuinely believed I was a struggling student drowning in debt. In their minds, Sydney was the brilliant, successful executive, and I was the miserable failure. They had no idea that the card I just handed the waiter was linked to an account holding more wealth than Harold had seen in his entire lifetime. They had no idea that while Sydney was boasting about starting a new job next week, I was the one who signed her offer letter. I glanced over at Terrence. He was still staring at the table, refusing to meet anyone's eye. My heart genuinely ached for him. He was a brilliant educator, a man who dedicated his life to helping underprivileged students understand history. Yet he was trapped in a toxic marriage where his worth was constantly measured against Sydney's delusional financial expectations. I made a silent promise right then and there. Terrence would not go down with their sinking ship. My mother, Patricia, leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She looked at me with an expression of fake pity. "You know, Diana, if you are really struggling with money after this, you can always ask Sydney for a loan. Once she starts her new director position at Axiom Innovations, she will be making a six-figure salary." "I will pass," I replied smoothly, keeping my tone light. "I prefer to clean up my own messes." The waiter returned, carrying the leather folder on a silver tray. He placed the folder softly in front of me, along with a sleek black pen. "Your receipt, madam," he said, his voice dripping with respect. "Everything went through perfectly. Thank you for your exceptional patronage today." I picked up the pen and added a generous tip. I signed my name with a swift, fluid motion. Harold scoffed, watching me sign. "Did you have to empty your entire checking account for that? I hope you do not expect us to buy your groceries next week." "Do not worry, Dad," I said, sliding the heavy metal card back into my purse. "My finances are completely handled. You should probably focus on your own." Patricia gasped, clutching her pearls. "How dare you speak to your father that way? You have absolutely no respect." "I have exactly as much respect as is warranted," I replied. I looked at the three of them sitting across from me. They were a perfect portrait of middle-class delusion masquerading as high society. They were entirely convinced they were untouchable. They had protected Sydney from every failure, shielded her from every mistake, and funded her every whim at my expense. But the bill was finally coming due. The lunch check I just paid was nothing compared to the staggering cost they were about to face. I checked my designer watch, which was carefully hidden under the cuff of my blazer. We had exactly 45 minutes until the commencement ceremony began. 45 minutes until the carefully constructed facade of their perfect suburban life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I stood up from the booth, smoothing the lines of my suit. "If you will excuse me, I need to head toward the university campus. I have some important matters to attend to before the ceremony starts." Sydney let out a sharp laugh. "Important matters? What do you have to do? Make sure your rented graduation gown is ironed." "Something like that," I said. I gave Terrence one last sympathetic look. "I will see you all at the arena." As I walked away from the table, I could hear my mother loudly complaining to Harold about my attitude. I did not care. I walked out of the restaurant, stepping into the bright Chicago sunlight, feeling absolutely invincible. The heavy titanium card in my purse was just a small fraction of my power. They wanted to play a game of status and wealth, but they did not realize they had just challenged the owner of the board. I had barely taken 10 steps down the sunlit Chicago pavement when the heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open behind me. The sharp clatter of my mother's heels and the heavy thud of my father's dress shoes signaled they were trailing right on my heels. They were not about to let me have the last word. In our family dynamic, Harold always needed to reassert his dominance whenever he felt his authority slipping. Harold caught up to me at the crosswalk. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and let out a condescending scoff. He was still hung up on the restaurant bill, entirely convinced that my gesture with the metal card was an act of financial recklessness. "I hope you feel proud of yourself, Diana." Harold sneered, his voice loud enough for passing pedestrians to hear. "Going into massive credit card debt just to show off at a lunch. You are going to be paying off that one meal for the next 6 months with interest." It is exactly that kind of irresponsible behavior that proves why we never invested a dime in your education. You have zero financial literacy. I stopped at the edge of the curb and turned to face him. The sheer audacity of his lecture was breathtaking. My mother and Sydney caught up standing flanked behind him like a loyal audience ready to watch my execution. Terence lingered a few paces back, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking utterly exhausted by them. "Financial literacy, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Is that what we are calling it now? Because I remember a very different conversation about my education." I did not raise my voice, but the sudden drop in my tone made Harold flinch. I let my mind flash back to a crisp Tuesday morning exactly 5 years ago. It was the day my acceptance letter to the MBA program arrived in the mail. I had worked tirelessly to earn my spot, staying up until 3 in the morning to perfect my application essays while juggling a full-time corporate job. When I saw the university seal on the thick envelope, my heart soared. I had run into the kitchen, tears of joy welling in my eyes, eager to share the news with the people who were supposed to be my biggest supporters. Harold and Patricia had been sitting at the kitchen island going over brochures for Sydney's upcoming European vacation. I placed the acceptance letter on the marble counter, my hands shaking with excitement. I told them I got in. I told them I was going to get my master's degree and build a real career. Harold did not even smile. He picked up the premium parchment paper, scanned the prestigious university letterhead, and then deliberately, methodically ripped the letter right down the middle. The sound of the thick paper tearing echoed in my head to this day. It was a violent, dismissive sound. He threw the torn halves into the trash can next to the island. "We are not paying for this," Harold had told me, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Investing in you is throwing money out the window. Sydney is the one with the real potential. She has the charm, the connections, and the drive to be an executive. You lack the necessary ambition. You are going to end up as a mediocre data entry clerk, Diana. Accept your place in life and stop bothering us with these foolish delusions." I stood there in the kitchen, completely shattered, watching my mother nod in agreement, while Sydney smirked from the doorway. They had broken me that day, but they had also ignited a fire in my chest that would never burn out. I had packed my bags that very afternoon, moved into a cheap apartment, and vowed I would never ask them for a single cent again. Now, standing on the busy Chicago street corner 5 years later, I looked Harold directly in the eye. "I remember you ripping my acceptance letter in half," I said, my words slicing through the warm summer air. "I remember you telling me I was destined to be a mediocre data entry clerk. You told me I had no potential. You told me investing in me was throwing money away. So do not stand here and lecture me about financial literacy. I paid for my own life, my own degree, and my own lunch. You do not get to comment on my finances ever again." Harold opened his mouth to argue, his face flushing a deep, angry red, but Sydney quickly jumped in to rescue him. She hated when the attention shifted away from her for more than 5 minutes, and she desperately needed to regain control of the narrative. "Oh, please, Diana, stop living in the past." Sydney sighed loudly, waving her manicured hand as if swatting away a fly. "Dad was just being realistic, and frankly, look at where we are now. You are still scraping by, throwing away your savings to look rich, while I am actually securing my future. Next week, my entire life elevates." She paused dramatically, waiting for the imaginary drum roll she believed she deserved. "Next week, I officially start my new position as the Director of Strategy at Axiom Innovations." Sydney boasted, her chest puffed out with unearned pride. "It is a billion-dollar fintech company. They are revolutionizing the entire financial sector. The hiring manager practically begged me to take the job. I will have a corner office, a massive team, and a 6-figure salary with stock options. I am practically going to be running the place. The CEO is notoriously private, but word on the street is they are looking for visionary leaders to take over the executive board. That is me, Diana. That is what real success looks like." Sydney smiled triumphantly, convinced she had just delivered the ultimate knockout punch. Patricia beamed, wrapping an arm around Sydney's shoulders. Harold nodded proudly, his anger at me instantly replaced by smug satisfaction in his golden child. They all stood there waiting for me to wither with jealousy. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to feel the crushing weight of my supposed inadequacy compared to Sydney's magnificent corporate triumph. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sleek, insulated water bottle. I unscrewed the cap and took a very slow, deliberate sip of the icy water. Behind the rim of the bottle, I hid a razor-sharp smirk. Sydney had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. She had no idea that the notoriously private CEO she just mentioned was standing less than 3 feet in front of her. She had no idea that Axiom Innovations was my company born in my tiny apartment 5 years ago. She had no idea that I personally reviewed her application, noted the glaring inconsistencies, and only approved her hiring so I could handle her termination myself. She thought she was about to run the place, but she did not even realize she was already standing on the gallows. If you are enjoying this story so far, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Have you ever had a toxic family member try to steal your joy just before a massive victory? Tell me about your experience in the comments below and stick around because Sydney's perfect delusion is about to shatter. I lowered my bottle and offered a polite nod. We turned and began the short walk toward the university campus. Throngs of graduates filled the sidewalks, creating a vibrant celebration. My family marched in a rigid formation. Harold and Patricia took the lead with Sydney flanked between them. Terrence and I trailed behind. Approaching the campus gates, Harold suddenly stopped. His posture stiffened and an artificial smile stretched across his face. Patricia immediately mirrored his expression. I followed their gaze and saw a wealthy couple walking toward us. They were the Belmonts' prominent members of my parents' country club. Mr. Belmont owned luxury car dealerships, and Mrs. Belmont served on local charity boards. Harold bounded forward, extending his hand with aggressive enthusiasm. "Richard, Beatrice, it is wonderful to see you here." The Belmonts stopped, returning the greeting with a polite but detached manner. "Yes, our nephew is graduating," Richard Belmont said. "And you are here for Sydney." Patricia stepped forward, beaming. "Oh, yes, we are bursting with pride. Our Sydney is the valedictorian of the entire MBA program. She will be delivering the commencement address this afternoon. We always knew she was destined for absolute greatness." I stood watching the lie slide off my mother's tongue. Sydney was barely passing the program. But in my parents' world, truth was secondary to optics. Sydney smiled demurely, playing the humble genius perfectly. "And that is not even the best news," Harold chimed in loudly. "Next week, Sydney starts her new executive role at Axiom Innovations." They rolled out the red carpet to recruit her. Beatrice Belmont raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Axiom Innovations. That is incredibly difficult to get into. Congratulations, Sydney." Patricia noticed me standing on the periphery. The Belmonts were about to look my way. Panic flashed in my mother's eyes. She could not risk her wealthy friends asking what her other daughter was doing. Patricia stepped directly in front of me, blocking me from view. Harold shifted his stance to close the gap, creating a solid human wall. I stood behind them, staring at the back of my mother's designer dress. I felt a surge of cold, clinical detachment. I did not peer around them. I did not try to introduce myself. I simply watched their pathetic, desperate need for validation unfold. "Well," Beatrice Belmont said, shifting her gaze to the tall African-American man standing quietly to my left. "Terrence, it is nice to see you. Are you still teaching high school history?" Terrence offered a polite, respectful nod. "Yes, ma'am. I am actually heading the history department next semester. We are implementing a new curriculum focusing on local civic engagement." Before Terrence could say another word, Sydney let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She stepped away from her parents and wrapped her arm around Terrence's bicep, digging her manicured nails into his sleeve. "Oh, Terrence is so sweet with his little teaching hobbies," Sydney told the Belmonts, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "But he will not be doing that for much longer. Now that I am stepping into this massive executive role at Axiom, we have decided it makes more sense for him to quit. He is going to be my stay-at-home personal assistant. Someone has to manage my schedule, pick up the dry cleaning, and run my errands while I am busy running a billion-dollar company." The sheer disrespect in her words hit the air like a physical blow. Terrence stiffened, his eyes widening in complete shock. He had dedicated his entire adult life to education. He loved his students, and he had worked relentlessly to earn his department head promotion. Sydney was casually discarding his entire career, treating his life work as an irrelevant hobby that existed only to be sacrificed for her daily convenience. The Belmonts exchanged a highly uncomfortable glance. Even in their wealthy, insular circles, casually humiliating your spouse in public was considered remarkably poor taste. I could not stay silent for another second. I stepped from behind the human wall my parents formed, moving directly into the center of the conversation. The sudden appearance of the hidden daughter startled the Belmonts, but I kept my focus entirely on Terence and Sydney. Teaching history is not a little hobby, I said, my voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority. Terence is shaping the minds of the next generation. He is an exceptional educator, and his promotion to department head is a massive professional achievement. It requires real intelligence and steadfast dedication. Suggesting he abandon a noble career to fetch your dry cleaning is not just insulting Sydney, it is completely delusional. Sydney gasped, her mouth dropping open in pure shock. She was not used to me speaking back to her, especially not in front of an important audience. Terence looked at me with a mixture of profound gratitude and sudden, intense fear. He knew exactly what was coming next. Harold spun around, his face contorted with intense, unbridled rage. He grabbed my arm, his thick fingers digging painfully into my blazer. He pulled me violently away from the Belmonts, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "Stop being so jealous," Diana Harold hissed violently, his voice a sharp, venomous whisper designed to cut deep. "You are embarrassing us. Not everyone can be a high earner like your sister. Terence's job is practically charity work compared to what Sydney is doing. Just because you are a bitter underachiever does not give you the right to tear down your sister on her big day. Keep your mouth shut, or I will have security escort you off the campus right now." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm, and then up into his furious eyes. I did not pull away. I did not cower. I just gave him a slow, terrifying smile. "Okay, Dad," I said softly, stepping back and smoothing my sleeve. "I will keep my mouth shut. Let us go watch Sydney shine." We joined the massive river of people flowing toward the grand commencement hall. The university arena was a colossal structure of glass and steel, practically vibrating with the collective energy of thousands of graduates and their ecstatic families. Loud cheers and the bright flashes of cameras punctuated the warm spring air as proud parents captured memories of their successful children. Banners bearing the university crest fluttered in the breeze, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and blooming flowers. As a graduating student of the highly prestigious Master of Business Administration program, my family was entitled to a specific allocation of premium seating. The university had mailed exactly 4 heavy gold-embossed VIP tickets to each family, guaranteeing them front-row access right at the base of the graduation stage. I held my single ticket loosely in my right hand, feeling the thick cardstock against my fingertips. For a fleeting second, I allowed myself to imagine sitting in that plush velvet chair, watching the ceremony unfold from the best vantage point in the house. I had earned that seat. I had spent 5 grueling years paying my own tuition, working through sheer exhaustion, and building my company from a cramped apartment just to reach this exact milestone. But as we approached the velvet ropes designating the VIP entrance, my father abruptly stopped walking. Harold planted his feet on the pavement, causing the rest of us to halt directly behind him. His eyes darted aggressively over the crowd of wealthy attendees filing into the exclusive section. Suddenly, his gaze locked onto a tall, silver-haired man stepping out of a chauffeured town car. It was Richard Montgomery, a notoriously ruthless private lender and commercial real estate mogul in the Chicago area. I knew immediately what was happening. Harold was drowning in secret debt from financing Sydney's lavish lifestyle, and he desperately needed a massive loan to keep his suburban facade from crumbling. Without a single word of warning, Harold spun around and lunged toward me, his face twisted with a sudden greedy calculation. His thick hand shot out, and he violently snatched the golden VIP ticket right out of my fingers. The paper gave a sharp tear as it slid from my grip, leaving me standing there with an empty hand. The physical audacity of the theft in broad daylight left Terence gasping in shock. Terrence was a good man trapped in a terrible situation, and his instinct to shield me from my own father was palpable. He took a protective step forward, opening his mouth to defend me, but Harold immediately silenced him with a vicious glare. "Do not even think about causing a scene," Harold growled, shoving the golden ticket into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. "I have a critical networking opportunity right in front of me, and I am not going to let your petty complaints ruin it." Before anyone could respond, Harold practically sprinted over to Mr. Montgomery. I watched from a few paces away as my father transformed into a fawning, desperate sycophant. He pumped the wealthy lender's hand aggressively, pointing back toward Sydney with a sickeningly proud smile. I could read his lips perfectly from where I stood. He was offering my hard-earned graduation ticket to Montgomery, bribing the lender with premium seating right next to the supposed valedictorian of the MBA program. He was using my graduation ticket to buy proximity to wealth. When Harold returned to our group, he looked incredibly smug. He adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest, looking at me with absolute disdain. The deal was done. He had given my seat away to a complete stranger. "Sydney is the face of this family," Harold stated, his voice cold and unwavering. "We need these seats to network for her new executive lifestyle. She is starting at Axiom Innovations next week, and she needs to be surrounded by the right kind of high net worth individuals. Having a major lender sitting with us in the VIP section elevates her status immensely. You can sit in the back." He did not offer an apology. He did not offer a shred of regret. He looked at me as if I was a piece of luggage that needed to be stowed away in the cargo hold. Sydney flipped her perfect blonde hair over her shoulder, letting out a soft, mocking laugh. She clearly relished watching me get stripped of my dignity right before her moment of glory. Patricia stepped forward, perfectly aligning herself with Harold's staggering cruelty. She reached out and pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the massive, imposing upper deck of the arena. Far above the velvet ropes and the cushioned chairs, there were rows of steep, uncomfortable aluminum bleachers. That was the overflow section, meant for distant relatives, latecomers, and people who did not warrant a formal invitation. "Your father is entirely right, Diana," Patricia said, her tone dripping with fake maternal concern. "We are trying to secure a billion-dollar future for your sister, and we simply cannot have you bringing down the aesthetic of the front row. You look tired anyway. Go find a spot up in the overflow bleachers. It is much more suited to your status. We will find you in the parking lot whenever the ceremony is finally over." Terrence looked at me, his eyes filled with profound sorrow and deep-seated anger. He was witnessing a level of familial abuse that defied all logic and decency. He took a breath, clearly preparing to sacrifice his own VIP ticket and march up to the bleachers with me. But I caught his eye and gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of my head. I needed him to stay right where he was. I needed him to witness the exact moment the pendulum swung. I looked at my family standing there in all their delusional arrogance. Sydney was preening, eager to march to the front and soak up the unearned admiration. Harold was practically vibrating with greed, eager to schmooze the wealthy lender he just bribed. Patricia was adjusting her designer pearls, eager to claim her spot as the mother of the most successful graduate in the building. They expected me to lower my head. They expected me to trudge up those concrete stairs and sit in the shadows nursing my broken heart. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. I just stared at them, letting a terrifying, absolute calmness wash over my features. I smiled, locking eyes with my mother. "Enjoy the front row view," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling register. "You are going to want to see this up close." I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving them standing at the VIP entrance, completely unaware of the absolute devastation that was waiting for them inside. I navigated the crowded concourse of the university arena, leaving my family basking in their stolen VIP access. The corridors echoed with the frantic, excited chatter of thousands of families rushing to find their seats. I bypassed the carpeted entrances to the lower bowls and headed straight for the concrete stairwell marked for general admission overflow. The climb was steep and punishing. With every concrete step I took, the air grew warmer and thinner, losing the crisp air conditioning that bathed the premium levels below. I climbed higher and higher until I reached the absolute back of the massive building. The overflow section consisted of cold aluminum bleachers pressed right up against the rafters. Up here, the graduation stage looked incredibly small, just a distant square of blue fabric and bright spotlights. I found an empty spot in the very last row and sat down, smoothing the fabric of my tailored blazer against the hard metal bench. From this elevated vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire arena. I looked down into the exclusive front row section. Even from hundreds of feet away, I could easily spot my family. Harold was aggressively leaning into Richard Montgomery, invading the lender's personal space with wild, animated gestures. Patricia was fanning herself while chatting up another wealthy-looking couple completely in her element. Sydney was the worst of all. She had draped a fake gold honor sash over her graduation gown and was spinning in circles, holding her phone high in the air. She was recording herself manufacturing a completely fabricated narrative of success for her social media followers. They looked like tiny plastic figurines trapped in a spectacular delusion of their own making. I sat alone in the shadows of the rafters, crossing my legs and settling in to watch the show. 10 minutes passed. The arena was filling up to maximum capacity, and the low roar of the crowd was becoming deafening. Suddenly, the heavy, distinct clanking of dress shoes striking the aluminum bleachers broke my concentration. I turned my head, expecting to see a late-arriving guest desperately searching for a seat. Instead, I saw Terrence. He was breathing heavily from the massive climb up the concrete stairs. His usually immaculate suit jacket was unbuttoned, and he had violently pulled his tie loose from his collar. His face was a devastating portrait of profound exhaustion and deep-seated disgust. He looked like a man who had just run a marathon with a boulder strapped to his back. He did not ask if the space next to me was taken. He simply collapsed onto the cold metal bench, letting out a ragged sigh and burying his face in his large hands. We sat in total silence for a long moment, isolated together in the nosebleeds while the noise of the graduating class swelled beneath us. Finally, Terrence lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and heavy with unshed emotion. "I am so sorry, Diana," he said, his voice rough and laced with absolute shame. "I should have stopped him. I should have physically stepped between you and Harold when he snatched your ticket. I should have told Sydney to shut her mouth at the restaurant. I just stood there and let them humiliate you. I am a coward." "You are not a coward, Terrence," I replied, keeping my tone gentle but entirely firm. "You are surviving. There is a massive difference between the two. They have a highly effective way of suffocating the fight out of people. I lived in that house for 18 years. I know exactly how that psychological warfare feels." Terrence shook his head vigorously, refusing to accept my grace. "No, you do not understand. It is not just about what happened today. It is every single day. I am drowning in this marriage, Diana. I am completely suffocating, and I cannot take another second of it." He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on his knees and staring down at the distant stage. "Sydney treats me like an unpaid servant. Her parents look at me like I am a mistake she desperately needs to fix. But the absolute worst part is what she makes me do to maintain her perfect, flawless image." I shifted on the aluminum bench, turning to give him my full, undivided attention. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quiet. Terrence let out a bitter, hollow laugh that held absolutely no humor. "Her Master of Business Administration degree," he said, shaking his head in disgust. "She did not earn it, Diana. She barely even attended the evening lectures. She spent her nights out at high-end bars, networking and racking up massive credit card debt, while I stayed home and did her academic work." My eyes narrowed as the gravity of his words hung in the warm air. He looked at me, his expression pleading for understanding. "At first it was just editing her papers," he explained. "Then it became writing the essays from scratch because she claimed she was too stressed to focus. By her second year, I was logging into her university student portal and completing entire online modules. I took her quizzes. I participated in her discussion boards. I did the heavy research. I did everything. If I ever refused, she would scream at me for hours, threatening to leave me, calling me a useless failure who was actively trying to sabotage her brilliant career. I just wanted peace in my own home. I just wanted the yelling to stop. Terrence rubbed his temples as if fighting off a massive blinding headache. I teach high school history all day long. I grade student papers until 6 in the evening. And then for the last 3 years, I stayed up until 2 in the morning teaching myself advanced corporate finance, business ethics, and statistical analysis just so she could pass her classes. I am exhausted, Diana. I am so tired of living this fraudulent lie. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with frightening electric clarity. Sydney was not just a narcissist, she was a complete academic fraud. And her brilliant, hardworking husband had just unwittingly handed me the exact ammunition I needed. The irony was almost too poetic to be real. As the chief executive officer of Axiom Innovations, I had personally reviewed the thesis submitted with Sydney's job application. I leaned toward him, my heart beating with a slow, rhythmic precision. "Terrence," I said, my voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that cut through the arena noise. "Tell me about the capstone project. Did you write her final thesis? The one on predictive financial algorithms?" Terrence looked genuinely shocked that I knew the specific, highly technical topic of her paper, but he nodded slowly. "Yes," he confessed, his voice laced with heavy defeat. "Every single word of it. I built the data models from scratch based on some side research I had been doing." Sydney did not even read the executive summary before she submitted it under her name to the university and to her new employer. I looked at this good, honorable man who had been ground into the dirt by my toxic sister. Then I looked down at the VIP section, where Sydney was currently waving at a camera, perfectly oblivious to her impending doom. I felt a smile spread across my face. It was not a polite smile. It was a genuine, dangerous, predatory smile. The kind of smile a hunter gets right before the steel trap snaps shut. "Do not apologize, Terrence," I said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Today, karma works overtime." I gave his shoulder one last firm squeeze, letting the weight of my promise settle between us. I told Terrence to stay exactly where he was and keep his eyes glued to the front row. I promised him that his days of functioning as an unpaid academic ghostwriter and a heavily abused personal assistant were officially coming to a permanent end. Without waiting for him to process the absolute certainty in my voice, I turned away from the cold aluminum bleachers and began my descent. Walking down the steep concrete stairs of the overflow section felt profoundly symbolic. With every step I took away from the sweltering rafters, I shed the heavy, suffocating skin of the invisible daughter. I was leaving behind the pathetic version of me that my parents had tried so desperately to construct. I was no longer the mediocre disappointment they constantly mocked at upscale restaurants. I was stepping entirely into the reality I had forged in the dark while they were busy polishing their fake suburban crown. I reached the main concourse level, where the chaotic noise of thousands of arriving family members echoed loudly off the polished tile floors. I ignored the frantic crowds and walked with absolute precision toward the far end of the arena. Tucked away behind a massive velvet curtain was a set of heavy, reinforced steel double doors marked with stark red lettering indicating restricted backstage access. Two massive security guards stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable human wall in front of the entrance. They wore crisp black suits and stern, unyielding expressions. Their entire purpose was to keep wandering relatives, lost students, and unauthorized personnel far away from the university officials and the commencement staging area. As I approached the restricted doors, the taller of the two guards immediately raised a thick hand, stopping me dead in my tracks. He looked me up and down, taking in my presence with a wall of professional detachment. He stated firmly that this specific hallway was strictly off-limits to general admission guests and students who were not part of the stage crew. He gestured back toward the chaotic main concourse, ordering me to return to the designated seating zones immediately. I did not step back. I did not flinch or apologize. I maintained my ground locking eyes with him and calmly stated that I needed to pass through those doors right now. The second guard stepped forward, his tone growing significantly more aggressive. He warned me that he would not hesitate to call for backup, to have me physically escorted out of the building if I refused to comply with his direct orders. My family had spent a lifetime trying to make me feel small and powerless, but these guards were simply doing their assigned jobs. I felt no anger toward them. I had absolutely no intention of arguing or causing a scene. I just needed the right person to open the gate. Before the situation could escalate any further, the heavy steel doors swung open violently from the inside. A man dressed in a flawlessly tailored charcoal gray suit rushed into the hallway, his sharp eyes scanning the area before landing directly on me. His name was Oliver, and he was my exceptionally brilliant chief of staff. He had been managing the complex daily operations of my corporate life for the past 3 years, anticipating my every strategic move with ruthless efficiency. Oliver took one look at the defensive posture of the security guards and immediately flashed a highly restricted university clearance badge that hung from a sleek black lanyard around his neck. He spoke with a commanding, authoritative voice, informing the guards that I was the anonymous donor responsible for the new $10 million technology wing and a highly anticipated personal guest of the university dean. The two security guards instantly dropped their aggressive stances. Their eyes widened in sheer shock as the reality of their mistake washed over them. They stepped aside hastily, mumbling a chaotic flurry of quick, respectful apologies. I offered them a polite nod to show there were no hard feelings before stepping past them. I followed Oliver into the cool, heavily air-conditioned hallways of the backstage VIP area. The contrast between the loud, sweaty public arena and this highly restricted zone was staggering. Here, the lighting was subdued and professional. The floors were covered in thick, premium carpeting that absorbed the sharp click of my heels. Oliver fell into step right beside me, walking with the intense, focused purpose of a man executing a flawless military operation. He handed me a sleek, encrypted tablet that glowed brightly with my private corporate dashboard. "CEO, protocol is ready." Ma'am Oliver stated, his voice a low, professional hum that conveyed absolute control. "The university dean has been fully briefed on the academic fraud situation. The commencement schedule has been slightly adjusted to accommodate your specific instructions. The private security detail is currently in position around the front row, and the public relations team is standing by to manage any corporate fallout." I took the tablet from his hands, feeling the smooth, cool glass beneath my fingertips. This device was a tangible representation of the massive financial empire I had forged from absolute nothingness. I was not just a graduating student today, I was the founder and chief executive officer of Axiom Innovations. I had built a financial technology powerhouse that was actively disrupting global markets and managing billions in assets. I had done it all in complete secrecy, without a single drop of emotional or financial support from the toxic people sitting comfortably in the VIP section outside. I stopped walking for a brief moment and tapped the illuminated screen, opening a highly restricted human resources file. The document that materialized was an official employment contract for the director of strategy position at my company. At the very bottom of the digital page sat Sydney's arrogant, looping signature. She had signed the document just 3 days ago, completely oblivious to the fact that the hiring manager who sent it was directly following my strict orders. Reading through the incredibly generous compensation package and the lavish stock options Sydney genuinely thought she had secured, I felt a cold surge of absolute authority. My parents had leveraged their entire future on this single piece of paper. They had taken out a massive second mortgage and risked total financial ruin just to maintain the illusion of Sydney's supremacy. They had handed her everything while leaving me with nothing but their contempt. But I owned the entire board now. I scrolled to the bottom of the digital file and located the bright red administrative button designated for immediate contract termination. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I did not feel a single ounce of familial guilt. I pressed my finger firmly against the screen, authorizing the immediate permanent cancellation of Sydney's employment. The corporate system processed the command, instantly sending an automated rejection and termination email directly to Sydney's personal phone. There would be no executive corner office. There would be no six-figure salary. There would be no glamorous lifestyle for my sister to flaunt in front of her country club friends. I handed the tablet back to Oliver, who tucked it smoothly under his arm with a respectful nod. A deep, resonant chord suddenly echoed through the backstage corridors. The grand, majestic notes of the graduation march began to play, swelling powerfully over the massive arena speakers. The music signaled the official start of the commencement ceremony. The moment of absolute reckoning had officially arrived. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin high, and walked purposefully toward the stage, ready to watch my family reap exactly what they had sown. The grand, majestic notes of the graduation march swelled through the massive arena, vibrating against the thick concrete walls and echoing across the towering steel rafters. From my concealed vantage point in the darkened wings of the backstage area, I had a perfect panoramic view of the entire commencement floor. I stood quietly beside Oliver, my arms folded securely across my chest, watching the endless sea of black academic gowns begin their slow, rhythmic procession down the center aisle. The energy in the building was electric, a chaotic mixture of profound relief, fierce pride, and overwhelming anticipation from thousands of families waiting to see their children cross the ultimate finish line. But my eyes were entirely fixed on the premium front row seating directly at the base of the stage. Harold and Patricia had already claimed their stolen VIP seats, and they were putting on a spectacular performance for anyone who would pay attention to them. My mother was holding her latest generation smartphone high in the air, actively live streaming the entire event to her social media accounts. I could practically hear her bragging to her wealthy country club friends through the screen, fabricating wildly exaggerated stories about her incredibly gifted daughter. Harold stood right beside her, his chest puffed out like a proud peacock, aggressively waving at the procession and making absolutely sure every wealthy business associate in his immediate vicinity knew exactly who he was there to support. Then I finally saw her. Sydney marched down the main aisle with an unbearable level of manufactured arrogance. While the other graduates walked with a sense of respectful, quiet decorum, Sydney was actively treating the commencement procession like her own personal red carpet runway. She was blowing overly dramatic kisses to the crowd, pausing to strike ridiculous poses for the professional photographers lining the walkway, and ensuring she remained the absolute center of attention. What made her stand out the most, however, was the massive glittering accessory draped aggressively across her shoulders. Sydney was wearing a thick, heavy gold sash that caught the bright arena spotlights with every single step she took. It was an unmistakable symbol of supreme academic achievement, universally recognized as the exclusive mark of a valedictorian. The only problem was that the university had never actually issued that prestigious sash to her. I knew for an absolute verified fact that Sydney had purchased that ridiculous fake prop off the internet just a few weeks ago simply to complete her delusional aesthetic. She had not earned a single thread of that gold fabric, but she wore it with the breathtaking confidence of a true sociopath, perfectly willing to lie to thousands of people just to feed her insatiable, fragile ego. As Sydney finally reached her designated seat, in the highly coveted front row of the graduate section, my personal phone vibrated softly in my tailored blazer pocket. I pulled the device out and glanced at the illuminated screen. It was a notification from our family group chat, a digital conversation thread I had been largely silent in for several years. Despite sitting in the middle of a highly formal academic ceremony, Sydney was already frantically typing away on her phone, completely ignoring the respected faculty members taking their places on the stage. I opened the chat application and watched her toxic messages flood the screen in real time. Sydney had sent a perfectly filtered selfie showing off her fake gold sash, with a caption dripping with venomous, unmistakable condescension. The message was directed entirely at me. It read that she just took her premium seat right at the front where the elite belong. She typed that it was such a shame I was completely lost in the crowd up in the cheap seats. She mocked me, saying she tried to look for me, but it was physically impossible to see anyone that far back in the dark shadows. She told me to make sure I had my camera ready, though. She claimed the event coordinators told her they always call the absolute top student up to the stage first. She bragged that she was about to deliver the commencement speech of a lifetime and formally announce her new executive position to the entire business world right there on the stage. She ended the text by telling me not to miss it. Immediately after her delusional message appeared, Harold and Patricia flooded the group chat with a massive barrage of heart emojis and celebratory praise. My mother typed out a lengthy response declaring that Sydney was the absolute undisputed pride of the entire family and that this graduation day would be remembered in their elite social circles for decades to come. I read their pathetic self-congratulatory messages with a profound sense of cold clinical detachment. I did not type a response. I did not try to defend myself. I simply looked up from my glowing screen and glanced high up into the massive aluminum bleachers. Even from this immense physical distance, I could easily spot Terence sitting completely alone in the nosebleeds, his head bowed in deep, miserable reflection. He was completely silent in the group chat, refusing to participate in his wife's delusional parade. He knew the ugly truth, and in just a few short minutes, the entire arena would know it too. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and turned my full attention to the main stage. The booming processional music gradually faded into complete silence, replaced by the low, excited murmur of the massive, restless crowd. The event coordinators scurried around the outer edges of the platform, finalizing the last-minute details before the broadcast began. Then the bright, overhead stadium lights began to dim. The sudden dramatic shift in illumination sent a massive ripple of heightened anticipation through the audience. The harsh white glare was swiftly replaced by a singular dramatic spotlight that cut through the darkness, focusing entirely on the heavy wooden podium at the absolute center of the stage. The heavy murmur of thousands of people instantly quieted down to a breathless, hushed silence. You could literally hear a pin drop in the colossal arena. Dean Harrison, an imposing and fiercely respected figure of academic authority, stepped out from the deep shadows. He adjusted his formal academic robes and walked slowly, purposefully toward the illuminated podium. His face was a mask of stern, unyielding gravity. He did not carry the usual celebratory notes of a joyful commencement speaker. He carried a single thin red folder containing information that would destroy lives. He grasped the edges of the wooden podium and leaned forward into the microphone. The hall fell dead silent. Dean Harrison leaned closer to the microphone, his hands gripping the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. The sharp screech of audio feedback pierced the quiet arena, making several people in the front row flinch. He did not offer a warm, welcoming smile. He did not say good morning to the esteemed faculty, proud parents, and graduating class. He bypassed the traditional formalities entirely. His gaze swept over the ocean of students resting heavily on the front row. The atmosphere shifted instantly from celebratory anticipation to profound, chilling confusion. People exchanged nervous glances. Harold and Patricia lowered their smartphones, sensing that something was terribly wrong, but entirely unable to comprehend what was coming. Sydney maintained her arrogant posture, though her fake gold sash suddenly looked garish under the harsh spotlight illuminating the stage. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the pinnacle of academic achievement." Dean Harrison began, his voice a deep, booming baritone that commanded absolute authority. A master's degree from this prestigious institution represents years of relentless dedication, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the pursuit of objective truth. Our alumni leave these sacred halls to lead major global corporations, shape complex economies, and set the strict ethical standards for the entire business world. Therefore, the fundamental foundation of everything we do here must be built on absolute, unassailable integrity. He paused, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch out again across the vast room. Down in the front row, Sydney shifted uncomfortably in her premium seat. The smug, superior smirk finally began to melt off her painted face. It is with a remarkably heavy heart that I must break from our long-standing commencement tradition. Dean Harrison continued opening the thin red folder resting on the wooden podium. He stared down at the documents inside, his expression rapidly hardening into pure, righteous academic fury. Before we award our degrees, we must address a severe breach of academic integrity. The disciplinary board has unequivocally proven that student Sydney has plagiarized her entire final thesis and coerced a non-student to complete her coursework. The damning words hit the massive arena like a sudden, devastating physical shockwave. A massive collective gasp erupted simultaneously from the thousands of people packed tightly into the building. The respectful silence was instantly shattered, replaced by a chaotic rising murmur of pure, unadulterated disbelief. Heads whipped around, frantically searching the massive crowd to identify the heavily disgraced student. But I did not need to search at all. From my concealed vantage point hidden in the wings, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the absolute devastation currently unfolding in the premium seating section. Sydney completely froze in place. All the vibrant color drained rapidly from her face, leaving her looking exactly like a pale, lifeless mannequin. Her mouth dropped completely open, but no actual sound managed to come out. The fake gold valedictorian sash draped arrogantly across her shoulders suddenly transformed from a symbol of stolen pride into a glaring neon sign highlighting her profound deceit. Beside her, Harold and Patricia looked exactly as though they had just been struck violently by lightning. Harold clutched his chest, his jaw hanging completely slack, while Patricia covered her mouth with both trembling hands, letting out a muffled, horrified, high-pitched shriek. The wealthy business associate sitting right next to them, the specific man Harold had actively bribed with my stolen VIP ticket, physically recoiled, pulling his expensive chair far away from my parents, as if their sudden public disgrace was a highly contagious, deadly disease. Dean Harrison did not stop speaking. He leaned closer into the microphone, raising his booming voice to cut sharply through the escalating chaotic noise of the heavily scandalized crowd. The objective evidence presented to the disciplinary board was absolute and entirely irrefutable, he stated firmly. We discovered an extensive, undeniable trail of digital footprints, unauthorized external system logins, and raw complex data models that were completely generated by an outside, unpaid party. This incident was not merely a brief momentary lapse in personal judgment. This was a systematic, highly calculated effort to deliberately defraud this university, completely bypass the rigorous academic standards of our program, and intentionally steal a degree that was never actually earned. Down in the front row, Sydney finally snapped out of her severely paralyzed physical state. She began to shake her head wildly, frantically whispering to Harold and Patricia that it was all just a massive, ridiculous misunderstanding. She clawed desperately at her graduation gown, looking frantically around the hall, exactly like a terrified, trapped animal. But there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The heavy, brilliant spotlight shifted directly from the wooden podium and intensely illuminated the front row, firmly pinning her exactly where she sat. Because of the unprecedented, overwhelming severity of this specific violation, the academic board immediately convened a special emergency session late last night. Dean Harrison announced, his deep voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. A final disciplinary decision was reached completely unanimously. The university strictly maintains a strict zero-tolerance policy for any form of academic fraud. Therefore, effective immediately, student Sydney is officially formally expelled from this educational institution. Her permanent academic record is permanently flagged with this violation. The master's degree she was scheduled to receive today is formally and permanently revoked. She will not cross this stage today. She will not join the prestigious ranks of our alumni. The brutal finality of his commanding words was absolutely, completely crushing. Harold jumped violently to his feet, his face rapidly turning a dark, violent shade of angry purple. He started shouting aggressively at the stage, loudly demanding to speak directly to the university president, immediately demanding elite legal representation, entirely blinded by his own frantic suburban entitlement. Patricia suddenly burst into loud, dramatic sobbing tears, grasping tightly at Sydney's shaking arms in sheer, utter panic. Their loud, pathetic protests were utterly useless here. The brutal, absolute truth had finally destroyed them. Justice prevailed. Dean Harrison commanded Sydney to leave the graduate seating immediately. The finality of that directive echoed through the cavernous arena. Down in the premium front row, Sydney was no longer a smug golden child bathing in unearned glory. She was completely paralyzed. The arrogant posture she had carried down the aisle evaporated, leaving behind a terrified hollow shell. Harold and Patricia lost their grip on their expensive smartphones. The devices clattered harshly against the polished concrete floor screens, cracking instantly. It was a perfect physical manifestation of their facade shattering into a million pieces. Sydney stood up abruptly, her chair screeching violently backward against the floor. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as pure panic overrode her logic. She began waving her arms frantically toward the stage, causing her fake gold sash to slip off her shoulder and drag humiliatingly across the ground. "This is a mistake," Sydney shrieked, her voice devoid of its usual charm. "You have the wrong person. I am Sydney. I am the Director of Strategy at Axiom Innovations. You cannot do this to me. Do you have any idea who my family is? My father is a highly influential businessman. We will sue this university into the ground. We will fire every single one of you." Her desperate threats echoed through the massive hall, but they landed completely flat. In her insular bubble, her parents' wealth had always functioned as an impenetrable shield. Whenever she failed, Harold and Patricia simply wrote a check. Sydney genuinely believed that screaming and dropping corporate names would force the dean to back down. She was utterly incapable of comprehending a reality where money could not purchase a clean slate. The thousands of people filling the arena did not cower at her threats. Instead, a collective wave of intense hostility rippled through the crowd. These were families who had mortgaged their homes and watched their children sacrifice years to legitimately earn their degrees. Watching a spoiled fraud stand in the front row and aggressively threaten to buy her way out of academic theft sparked absolute outrage. Boos and angry shouts began to erupt from the upper sections, raining down on Sydney like a torrential downpour of public shame. Harold grabbed Sydney's wrist, pulling her desperately, trying to force her to sit down. Patricia was weeping uncontrollably, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in dark, jagged streaks. But Sydney violently yanked her arm out of her father's grasp. The realization that Harold could not bribe his way out of this public execution finally hit her. She was entirely cornered. The spotlight was burning into her skin, and thousands of furious eyes were locked directly on her. She needed a scapegoat to absorb the devastating impact of her catastrophic failures. Sydney spun around wildly, her eyes scanning the massive crowd. She bypassed the disapproving faces of the faculty and ignored the disgusted glares of her fellow graduates. She tilted her head back and looked high up into the distant aluminum bleachers. She knew exactly who was sitting up there. She knew exactly who had spent 3 years sacrificing sleep to meticulously craft the brilliant data models she had proudly submitted as her own. "It was not me!" Sydney screamed, pointing her finger aggressively toward the nosebleeds. Her voice tore through the arena, amplified by the sheer desperation of a cornered predator. "I did not write it. My husband wrote it. Terrence wrote the entire thesis. He logged into my student portal. He generated the data models. He forced me to submit it. Arrest him. It is his fault. He is the criminal. He orchestrated this massive fraud. Arrest my husband right now." The profound depravity of her accusations struck the arena like a physical blow. The angry shouting from the crowd instantly transformed into a massive collective gasp of pure, unadulterated disgust. Throwing a spouse completely under the bus in front of 10,000 people, attempting to criminalize the very man who had sacrificed his own well-being to secure her unearned success, was a level of toxic betrayal that defied all basic human decency. High up in the shadows of the aluminum bleachers, Terrence sat completely frozen. He did not flinch or try to hide his face. He simply stared down at the woman he had married, loved, and protected for years. The physical distance between them was massive, but I could clearly see the exact moment his heart hardened into cold, impenetrable stone. Any lingering shred of loyalty he held for Sydney was instantly vaporized by her venomous, desperate accusation. He was finally seeing the absolute truth of who she was, a ruthless, parasitic narcissist. Down on the main floor, the university security protocol was officially initiated. 4 large security guards in crisp black suits stepped out from the side aisles, moving with swift tactical precision toward the front row. They surrounded Sydney, creating a tight, unyielding perimeter around her and her horrified parents. One guard firmly grasped Sydney's elbow, ignoring her frantic thrashing and desperate pleas. They were prepared to physically extract her from the building and end the spectacle once and for all. Sydney was sobbing loudly now, a pathetic mess of tangled blonde hair and ruined pride. She clawed at the guard's hands, begging Harold to do something, demanding that Patricia call their lawyers. The guards stepped forward, coordinating their movements to march her out the side exit. As they began to pull her away, Dean Harrison stepped forcefully back up to the microphone. He raised his right hand high into the air, his palm flat and commanding. The authoritative gesture signaled the security team to halt their extraction. The guards stopped, keeping a firm hold on Sydney but waiting for further instruction. Dean Harrison adjusted his academic robes and looked down at Sydney with an expression of absolute unyielding power. The graduation music had stopped, leaving nothing but the heavy, highly charged silence of a crowd waiting for the final devastating blow to land. "Security, wait," Dean Harrison commanded into the microphone. His voice sliced through the heavy, charged atmosphere of the arena, instantly halting the 4 large guards in their tracks. They maintained their firm grip on Sydney, but stopped moving toward the side exit. Sydney sniffled loudly, her makeup ruined, and her fake gold sash dragging pathetically on the floor. Harold and Patricia looked up at the podium, a tiny, desperate spark of delusional hope flashing in their eyes. They likely believed the dean was about to offer a reprieve, a compromise, or a chance for them to write a massive check to make this entire nightmare disappear. They were entirely wrong. "There is one more announcement that must be made before we proceed with the commencement," Dean Harrison stated. His tone shifted completely, leaving behind the cold academic fury and adopting a profound, deep reverence. "We have just witnessed a tragic display of entitlement and fraud, but this university is not defined by those who break our ethical codes. We are defined by those who rise above every imaginable obstacle to achieve genuine, undeniable greatness. We must now introduce our true valedictorian." A wave of fresh anticipation swept through the massive crowd. The thousands of attendees who had just been booing Sydney now leaned forward in their seats, eager to hear a story of actual merit. I remained perfectly still in the shadows of the backstage wings, watching the scene unfold with absolute satisfaction. Oliver stood silently beside me, his tablet glowing faintly in the dim light. Down in the overflow bleachers, Terrence was watching the stage with wide, unblinking eyes. The student who earned the top honor today did not come from a place of unearned privilege. Dean Harrison continued, his voice echoing powerfully across the vast arena. She did not rely on family connections to open doors. She did not have her tuition paid for by wealthy parents. In fact, she received absolutely zero financial support. While other students were spending their evenings networking at upscale bars or attending lavish social events, this specific student was working 80 hours a week just to keep a roof over her head and pay for her textbooks. Harold and Patricia exchanged a highly confused glance. They had completely written me off years ago, convinced I was a miserable failure drowning in debt. The description of a hard-working, independent student did not trigger a single thought of me in their minds. They simply assumed the dean was talking about some random scholarship recipient. But she did not merely survive the rigorous demands of our Master of Business Administration program. Dean Harrison elaborated, his voice swelling with immense pride. She took the complex economic theories and financial algorithms taught in these very classrooms and applied them in real time. She did not wait for a corporate recruiter to hand her an opportunity. Working entirely in secret from a cramped apartment, she coded, designed, and launched her own financial technology platform. Sydney stopped struggling against the security guards. Her bloodshot eyes darted toward the podium. As a woman who had just falsely bragged about securing a high-level position in the financial technology sector, the dean's words suddenly felt uncomfortably relevant to her specific interests. Over the past 5 years, this extraordinary student single-handedly built a multi-billion-dollar fintech empire, Dean Harrison announced. The crowd let out a massive collective gasp of sheer awe. A multi-billion-dollar empire built by a student sitting in this very room was a staggering, incomprehensible achievement. She created a platform that is currently revolutionizing the global banking sector. She employs thousands of people worldwide and manages massive portfolios for the most prestigious financial institutions on the planet. And she managed to accomplish all of this monumental success while maintaining a perfect academic grade point average. The entire arena was buzzing now. Students in the graduating class were looking around wildly, trying to identify the secret billionaire hiding among them in a plain black graduation gown. Harold leaned forward in his front row seat, his eyes wide with blatant, greedy curiosity. A billionaire CEO was exactly the kind of person he desperately wanted to schmooze to save his failing suburban facade. Furthermore, Dean Harrison said, raising a hand to quiet the excited murmurs of the crowd, "True leadership is not just about accumulating massive wealth. It is about elevating the community around you." Yesterday afternoon, this remarkable graduate finalized a philanthropic contribution that will forever change the landscape of this institution. She has anonymously donated $10 million to fully fund the construction of our new Advanced University Tech Center, ensuring that future generations of innovators will have the resources they need to change the world. The arena erupted into spontaneous, thunderous applause. Thousands of people were cheering for a person they had not even seen yet. The contrast between this genuine, powerful admiration and the disgust they had shown Sydney just moments ago was absolute poetry. Sydney stood frozen, her ruined face twisting with a sudden, agonizing realization. The details were aligning too perfectly. The industry, the timeline, the staggering success. It is time to reveal the identity of our anonymous donor, and our true valedictorian, Dean Harrison, declared, his voice ringing with triumphant joy. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to the main screens. The massive high-definition projector screens, suspended high above the graduation stage, suddenly blinked out of their neutral blue holding patterns. The arena lights dimmed even further, allowing the brilliant digital displays to command the absolute attention of every single person in the building. For a fraction of a second, the screens remained pitch black. Then, with a sharp, dramatic flash, a colossal high-resolution image materialized across all the displays simultaneously. It was a massive, larger-than-life reproduction of the latest issue of Forbes magazine. The bold, iconic white letters of the publication title stretched across the top. Below the title, dominating the entire cover, was a striking professional portrait. The woman in the photograph was wearing a sharp, tailored, midnight blue blazer, her arms folded confidently, her expression projecting absolute, unyielding executive power. The bold yellow headline printed across the bottom of the magazine cover read, "The Unstoppable Rise of Axiom Innovations and its Visionary CEO." The face looking down at the 10,000 people in the arena was mine. It was Diana. Down in the premium front row, Harold let out a loud, strangling gasp, as if all the oxygen had just been violently sucked right out of his lungs. Patricia physically recoiled, her hands flying up to cover her face as she stared up at the towering 50-foot image of the daughter she had mocked, insulted, and discarded. Sydney let out a high-pitched, completely shattered wail, her knees finally buckling beneath her as the absolute crushing weight of the truth completely destroyed her delusional world. Please welcome our true valedictorian and the Chief Executive Officer of Axiom Innovations, Diana. Dean Harrison's voice echoed with immense power over the sophisticated sound system. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the backstage wings. The heavy velvet curtain fell closed behind me as I walked into the blinding glare of the stadium spotlights. My black graduation gown flowed behind me with every calculated step, but I did not look like a standard student. I carried the absolute, unshakable authority of an executive who had built a financial empire from the ground up. As I moved toward the wooden podium, the sheer magnitude of the moment hit the arena. 10,000 people rose to their feet in perfect unison. A massive, deafening roar of applause shook the concrete foundation of the building. It was a genuine, spontaneous standing ovation. They were not just cheering for a graduating student, they were cheering for a self-made titan who had just donated $10 million to their university. I reached the center of the stage and shook Dean Harrison's hand. He offered me a profound nod of deep respect before stepping back to give me the floor. I grasped the smooth edges of the podium and looked out over the endless sea of cheering faces. The energy was absolutely electric, but my eyes immediately sought out the premium front row. The contrast between the roaring celebratory stadium and the absolute silent horror of my family was breathtaking. Harold stood entirely paralyzed. His jaw had literally dropped open, exposing his profound disbelief. The wealthy country club friends and powerful business associates he had spent the entire morning trying to impress were now actively staring at him with deep confusion and intense disgust. His entire facade of suburban superiority had evaporated in a matter of seconds. Beside him, Patricia was physically shaking. The vibrant color had completely drained from her carefully powdered face, leaving her looking chalk white and terrified. She reached out with trembling fingers and grabbed Harold's arm, digging her manicured nails into his expensive suit jacket. "Harold, what did we do?" Patricia whispered. I could read her lips perfectly from the stage. That single, desperate question held the heavy, crushing weight of 32 years of blatant favoritism and unchecked cruelty. They had poured their entire lives and all their financial resources into propping up a massive fraud. Meanwhile, they had actively discarded the daughter who actually possessed the brilliance and drive to change the world. They had insulted a billionaire CEO over a lunch bill just hours earlier. They had stolen my VIP ticket to bribe a private lender. The horrific reality of their catastrophic miscalculation was finally settling into their bones. Over in the side aisle, the situation was even more pathetic. Sydney was still surrounded by the crisp black suits of the university security team. She looked exactly like a ghost. Her eyes were completely hollow, and her mouth opened and closed silently as she stared up at my massive portrait on the Forbes magazine cover, projected behind me. The arrogant, cruel sister who had demanded I pay for lunch, who had mocked me for being poor, who had bragged about taking a high-level executive job at my company, was now completely shattered. She realized in that exact moment that I had been the one pulling the strings the entire time. I was the one who had read her fraudulent application. I was the one who controlled her entire professional destiny, and she had just lost everything. I leaned into the microphone, letting the deafening applause wash over me for another long moment before raising my hand. The massive crowd slowly quieted down, settling back into their seats with eager anticipation. "Thank you." I began, my voice ringing with smooth, calm authority. 5 years ago, I sat in a cramped studio apartment with nothing but a broken laptop and a mountain of unpaid bills. I was told by people who should have believed in me that I had absolutely zero potential. I was told that investing in my education was throwing money out the window. I was told to accept a mediocre life and stay in the shadows forever. A hushed silence fell over the arena. Down in the front row, Harold physically flinched as I repeated his exact cruel words back to him. "But potential is not something anyone else can define for you." I continued, looking directly at my parents. "Potential is not granted by wealthy connections or superficial charm. True potential is forged in the absolute darkest moments of your life, when you have to decide whether to let the world break you or let it fuel your rise." I chose to build. I worked 80-hour weeks. I slept on the floor of my office. I poured every ounce of my energy into creating Axiom innovations because I knew that success is never given, it is relentlessly earned. The audience erupted into another round of passionate applause. I let my gaze sweep past the devastated front row and travel high up into the aluminum bleachers. I found Terrence sitting exactly where I had left him. He was standing up now, clapping his hands together with a look of pure, awestruck vindication on his face. I gave him a subtle, firm nod, a silent promise that his terrible nightmare was also coming to an end. To the graduating class today, I offer this advice, I said, returning my focus to the crowd. Do not ever let anyone tell you your worth. Do not let toxic people dictate your path, even if those people share your bloodline. Cut the heavy anchors loose. Protect your peace, and build your empire in silence. Let your massive success be the only noise you make. Thank you, and congratulations to the true graduates of this incredible institution. I stepped back from the podium as the stadium exploded into an absolute frenzy of cheers and whistles. The triumphant graduation music swelled over the speakers once more. I did not look back at my family. I did not need to see their pathetic, desperate faces anymore. I had claimed my power on the biggest stage possible. I turned and walked smoothly back toward the restricted VIP wings, feeling incredibly light and completely unstoppable. The ceremony concluded rapidly after my speech, and the massive crowd began to disperse into the concourses. I knew exactly what was coming next. My parents and Sydney were going to try to corner me. They were going to try to manipulate their way back into my life now that they knew my true net worth. But I was more than prepared for their desperate ambush. I entered the secluded sanctuary of the private VIP lounge located just off the main concourse. Oliver had ensured the room was perfectly prepared for my arrival. The space was an oasis of calm, featuring plush leather seating, subdued lighting, and a catered spread of premium hors d'oeuvres. I took a glass of sparkling water from a silver tray and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling university campus. I did not have long to wait. Less than 5 minutes after the commencement ceremony officially concluded, the heavy mahogany doors at the end of the hallway began to rattle violently. A loud, chaotic altercation erupted directly outside my private suite. "Do not you dare touch me. I am the mother of the chief executive officer. We are her family. Get your hands off my husband right now. Let us through." Patricia's shrill, frantic voice pierced through the thick walls. The heavy wooden doors suddenly burst open. Harold pushed his way aggressively past a highly flustered university official, his face red with exertion and sheer panic. Patricia marched right behind him, practically dragging a completely devastated Sydney by the wrist. Sydney looked like a walking disaster. Her graduation cap was missing, her mascara had run down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks, and she was still desperately clutching that pathetic fake gold sash in her trembling hands. As soon as Patricia spotted me standing near the windows, her entire demeanor shifted with terrifying speed. The aggressive, screaming woman vanished instantly, replaced by a sickeningly sweet, entirely manufactured version of a loving mother. Her eyes lit up with wild, greedy desperation. She threw her arms wide open and rushed across the premium carpeting, her designer heels sinking into the plush fabric. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant girl!" Patricia cried out, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We are just so incredibly proud of you. I always knew you had this kind of massive greatness inside you." She lunged forward, fully intending to wrap me in a tight familial embrace and pretend the last 32 years of blatant emotional abuse had never happened. I did not move a single inch. I simply kept my hands resting calmly at my sides and gave a very subtle, sharp nod to my security detail. Instantly, 2 massive bodyguards in crisp, dark suits stepped directly in front of me. They crossed their thick arms and planted their feet, creating an absolute impenetrable wall of solid muscle between me and my mother. Patricia crashed abruptly into the physical barrier, letting out a shocked, indignant gasp as she bounced back from the guards. "Diana? Darling, tell these brutes to move!" Patricia demanded, her fake smile faltering for a split second before she forced it back onto her face. "It is your mother. We are here to celebrate your colossal achievement. We knew you would make it to the very top. We really did." Harold quickly stepped up beside her, smoothing his wrinkled suit jacket and nodding with aggressive, forced enthusiasm. "Your mother is exactly right, Diana. We are absolutely thrilled. We were just using tough love to make you completely independent. We knew you needed a harsh push to activate your true executive drive. We played the bad guys on purpose so you would build this incredible empire. And look how perfectly our strategy worked. I stared at them, my expression colder than ice. The sheer magnitude of their gaslighting was almost breathtaking. They were standing in my private lounge, actively trying to convince me that decades of vicious psychological torment had actually been a secret, benevolent parenting strategy. They honestly believed I was foolish enough to accept this rewrite of history just because they were smiling at me now. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the line of bodyguards, but I did not ask them to move. I looked directly into Harold's desperate, greedy eyes. Tough love. I asked, my voice a low, dangerous whisper that commanded the entire room. Is that what we are calling it now? Because exactly 2 hours ago we were sitting in a restaurant and you did not seem to be playing a character. You seemed to genuinely believe every single vicious word you spat at me. Patricia nervously wrung her hands, her eyes darting to Oliver and the security guards, who were witnessing their humiliation. Sweetheart, that was just a test of your financial resilience. We wanted to see how you handled pressure. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that made Harold flinch. A test. You handed Sydney a $100,000 check for a house down payment and slid a $1,200 lunch bill across the table to me. You looked me dead in the eye and told me I had absolutely zero potential. You explicitly stated that investing in my education was throwing money out the window. You called me a mediocre disappointment who was used to living like a peasant. Harold swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Diana, you have to understand the optics. We were just trying to motivate you. You did not motivate me, Harold. I fired back, my voice rising with undeniable authority. You tried to destroy me. When I showed you my acceptance letter to this exact university 5 years ago, you ripped it in half and threw it in the garbage. You told me I lacked ambition. You said Sydney was the only face of this family. Just an hour ago, you physically snatched my graduation ticket out of my hands to bribe a private lender because you are suffocating in suburban debt. Do not stand in my private suite and pretend your cruelty was some noble master plan. You are not a strategic genius, Harold. You are just a greedy, desperate man who realized he bet his entire life savings on the wrong horse. I shifted my gaze to Sydney, who was cowering behind her parents. She looked completely shattered, devoid of the arrogant venom she had displayed at the restaurant. She opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling violently. Diana, please. Sydney whimpered, clutching the ruined gold sash. I am so sorry about the lunch. I was just stressed about my new job at Axiom. You know how much pressure I am under. You have to help me fix this. I looked at my sister, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. She was still completely delusional. She still thought there was a job waiting for her. She still thought money and family ties could erase the massive academic fraud she had just committed in front of 10,000 people. The trap I had carefully laid was fully primed, and it was time to spring it. Sydney sniffled loudly, wiping a stray tear from her cheek, but the moment my silence stretched, her vulnerable act completely evaporated. The sheer panic that had gripped her in the arena was suddenly replaced by a wild, manic sense of entitlement. She looked around the lavish VIP lounge, taking in the expensive catering and my imposing security detail, and a dangerous, delusional light sparked in her eyes. The reality of my wealth had finally eclipsed the reality of her public humiliation. She stepped out from behind Harold and Patricia, squaring her shoulders, as if she had suddenly remembered she was supposed to be the golden child. Diana, you are a billionaire, Sydney stated, her voice rising with frantic, demanding energy. You have more money than God. You donated $10 million to this university today. You practically own the dean. You can fix this entire mess right now. Just write them another check. Buy them off. Pay whoever you need to pay to make that plagiarism accusation disappear and reinstate my Master of Business Administration degree. They will listen to you. You are their biggest donor. I stared at her, completely stunned by the absolute moral bankruptcy of her request. She had just been caught orchestrating a massive academic fraud, coercing her husband into doing years of labor, and her immediate instinct was to demand I use my self-made fortune to bribe university officials to cover her tracks. And while you are at it, Sydney continued stepping even closer, her tone shifting from a plea to an aggressive command. You need to confirm my director of strategy job at Axiom Innovations right now. I signed the offer letter 3 days ago. Since you are the chief executive officer, you can just bypass human resources and fast-track my executive onboarding. I am your sister Diana. We are blood. It makes perfect sense for me to be your second in command. We can run the company together. You can handle the back-end development, and I will be the public face of the brand. I already told all my friends and followers about my six-figure salary. You cannot leave me hanging. Patricia chimed in immediately, her greed completely overriding any residual shame she might have felt. Yes, Diana, that is a brilliant idea. Your sister has excellent social connections. She would be an absolute asset to your executive board. This is how wealthy families operate. They protect their own and keep the power consolidated. You have to save her reputation. It is your duty as her sister. Harold nodded aggressively, stepping up beside Sydney. We can put all this ugliness behind us today. You fix the university scandal, you honor Sydney's employment contract, and we can go celebrate as a united family. This is a massive opportunity for all of us to elevate our status. I looked at the three of them standing there with their hands practically outstretched, expecting me to simply hand over the keys to my empire. They had spent my entire life breaking me down, ensuring I had absolutely nothing, and the very second they discovered I had built a fortress, they demanded the penthouse suite. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their delusion was almost magnificent in its sickness. They truly believed that blood entitled them to the fruits of my labor. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or scream or match their frantic energy. I simply turned my head slightly and looked at Oliver, who was standing silently by the mahogany doors. I extended my right hand palm facing upward. Oliver stepped forward smoothly, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket. He reached into his inner pocket and produced a sleek black leather portfolio. He placed it precisely into my waiting hand and stepped back, returning to his post without uttering a single syllable. I opened the portfolio. Inside rested a crisp, pristine stack of heavy corporate documents. I pulled out the top packet. It was the official Axiom Innovations executive employment contract. Sydney saw the familiar Axiom logo printed at the top of the page, and a hungry, victorious smile spread across her face. She actually let out a small sigh of relief, genuinely believing I was about to sign off on her outrageous demands. She thought she had won. She thought the golden child armor was impenetrable. I looked down at the document, my eyes scanning the heavily negotiated terms. Director of Strategy. I read aloud, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet lounge. Starting base salary of $250,000. Comprehensive executive benefits package. A generous signing bonus, and a highly lucrative tiered stock option plan. It is a spectacular offer, Sydney. The kind of offer that changes a person's entire life trajectory. The kind of offer reserved for the most brilliant, ethical, and hardworking minds in the financial technology sector. Sydney nodded eagerly, reaching her hand out to take the paperwork. Exactly, she said, her voice breathless with anticipation. And I am ready to start on Monday. I already bought a new designer wardrobe for the office. I looked away from the contract and locked my eyes directly onto hers. The cold, dead seriousness in my gaze made her outstretched hand freeze in midair. I gripped the top of the thick packet with both hands. I did not break eye contact for a fraction of a second. Then, with a slow, deliberate, and agonizingly loud motion, I tore the entire contract right down the middle. The sound of the thick premium paper ripping in half echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Sydney let out a sharp, strangled gasp, stumbling backward as if I had physically struck her. Patricia screamed, covering her mouth in sheer horror. Harold lunged forward, a furious objection dying in his throat, as my security detail immediately squared their shoulders, warning him to stay exactly where he was. I placed the two torn halves of the contract together, gripped them tightly, and ripped them again, reducing Sydney's billion-dollar corporate future into worthless, jagged shreds of trash. I let the pieces fall from my hands, fluttering down onto the expensive carpet right at Sydney's feet. I do not hire frauds, I said, my voice a lethal, absolute whisper that cut straight to the bone. Axiom Innovations is built on integrity, brilliance, and relentless hard work. You possess absolutely none of those qualities. You are an academic thief, a manipulative narcissist, and an incredibly cruel person. I would not hire you to empty the trash bins in my server room, let alone run my corporate strategy. Sydney dropped to her knees, staring blankly at the shredded pieces of paper littering the floor. Her hands hovered over the debris, trembling violently as the absolute finality of her situation crashed down on her. The delusions were completely dead. There was no billionaire sister coming to her rescue. There was no executive corner office. There was no glamorous future. Human Resources sent your official termination email 10 minutes ago. I continued stepping closer so she could hear every single syllable with perfect clarity. You are permanently blacklisted from my company and every corporate affiliate we work with. Good luck paying off that $150,000 student loan with no degree and no job. The specific mention of the $150,000 loan hit Harold like a physical blow to the chest. The angry red flush that had dominated his face all afternoon vanished instantly, replaced by an ashen, sickly pallor. His eyes darted nervously around the private VIP lounge, suddenly avoiding eye contact with the university officials and my security detail. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the heavy mahogany table. "How do you know the exact amount?" Harold stammered, his voice dropping an octave as pure, unadulterated panic began to set in. "You have been out of our lives for 5 years. We never told anyone the exact figures. Not even your sister knew the exact terms of that specific financial arrangement. I kept my posture perfectly straight, projecting the absolute authority of a chief executive officer who always did her due diligence. When you run a billion-dollar financial technology empire, you employ some of the most brilliant analytical minds on the planet." I explained, my tone completely even and devoid of any sympathy. "A few weeks ago, when Sydney's employment contract crossed my desk, I had my risk assessment team run a comprehensive financial background check on my immediate family. I did it entirely out of morbid curiosity, just to see how the people who threw me away were managing their supposedly perfect suburban existence." Patricia let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She reached out and grabbed Harold's arm, her manicured fingers trembling violently. "Harold, tell me she did not see the bank statements. Tell me this is just another one of her bluffs. She cannot possibly know about the secondary accounts." "I did not need to bluff Patricia," I replied smoothly, cutting her off before Harold could even attempt to spin another pathetic lie. "My analysts uncovered absolutely everything. You have been walking around this campus all day, bragging to your wealthy country club friends about how you sacrificed your vast savings to fund Sydney's brilliant academic journey. You looked me dead in the eye at the restaurant and told me you drained your accounts for her tuition. But my team found the ugly, undeniable truth. You did not use your savings 5 years ago because you did not have any savings left." The air in the VIP lounge felt incredibly heavy. Sydney, still kneeling on the floor amidst the shredded pieces of her employment contract, looked up at her parents with wide, confused eyes. She was finally realizing that the endless well of money she had been drinking from was completely poisoned. "You took out a massive, high-interest second mortgage on your primary residence," I stated, letting the brutal facts echo through the quiet room. "You leveraged the very roof over your heads to pay the exorbitant tuition costs for a daughter who was secretly having her husband complete her coursework. You funded her designer wardrobe, her luxury vacations, and her high-end lifestyle by maxing out every single line of credit you could secure. You are drowning in a terrifying amount of suburban debt." Harold opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came out. His chest was heaving and a thick layer of sweat had formed across his brow. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had permanently snapped shut. He knew that I possessed the exact ledgers proving his staggering financial incompetence. "The most pathetic part of your entire financial strategy was your exit plan." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward my father. "You were betting absolutely everything on Sydney landing this specific executive role at Axiom Innovations. You structured your loans with a predatory balloon payment that is coming due at the very end of this month. You genuinely believed her new 6-figure salary and corporate signing bonus would instantly bail you out of the massive financial crater you dug for yourselves. You staked your entire future on the earning potential of a woman who just got permanently expelled for academic fraud. Patricia began to hyperventilate. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to lean her entire weight against Harold just to remain standing. "We are going to lose the house," she whispered, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her impending doom. "Harold, the bank is going to take the house. Our friends will find out. The country club will revoke our membership. The neighbors will see the foreclosure signs on the front lawn. We will be completely ruined. You are exactly 3 weeks away from total unavoidable bankruptcy." I confirmed, delivering the final devastating calculation without a single ounce of familial guilt. "Your credit scores are thoroughly destroyed. You have zero liquid assets. And the daughter you sacrificed everything for has absolutely no means of providing you with a financial rescue. The pristine, flawless image you cared about more than your own flesh and blood is officially dead." Harold stared at me, his eyes wide with sheer absolute terror. The arrogant, domineering patriarch who had ripped my acceptance letter in half, who had stolen my VIP ticket, who had repeatedly called me a worthless failure, completely vanished. In his place stood a broken, desperate man facing total annihilation. He looked at the heavy gold watch on my wrist, the expensive cut of my tailored blazer, and the imposing security guards flanking my sides. He suddenly realized that I was the only person on earth possessing the resources to save him from living on the streets. Harold dropped his pride entirely. His shoulders slumped forward, and he clasped his hands together in a pathetic begging gesture. "Diana, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a desperate, humiliating whine. "You are a billionaire. You just donated $10 million to this university without even blinking. $150,000 is absolute pocket change to you. It is a rounding error in your daily budget. You could pay off our second mortgage with a single phone call. You could clear our debts and save our home." He took a tentative step toward me, tears actually forming in the corners of his desperate eyes. "I know we made mistakes," he begged, holding his trembling hands out toward me. "I know we were harsh. I know I should not have taken your ticket today. But we are blood. You have the power to fix this right now. Please, Diana, write the check. Save us. Do not let us lose everything we have ever worked for." I stood perfectly still, watching the man who had tormented me for 3 decades beg for his financial life. I did not feel a single shred of vindication or joy. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound sense of closure. The invisible chains that had bound me to their toxic expectations shattered completely, leaving me feeling incredibly light and entirely untouchable. They had finally shown their true colors, choosing greed over pride when the consequences of their actions came to collect. I looked Harold dead in the eye, my expression an impenetrable mask of cold executive authority. "I only invest in potential," I said, my voice steady and absolute. "You do not have it." The heavy silence that followed my absolute rejection of my father was suddenly broken by the sound of the thick mahogany doors opening behind my security detail. Oliver stepped aside smoothly, nodding respectfully to the tall figure entering the private VIP lounge. It was Terrence. He had finally made the long, exhausting descent from the sweltering overflow bleachers. He was breathing heavily, his suit jacket draped loosely over his arm, and his tie completely removed from his collar. Despite the obvious physical exertion of navigating the massive arena, there was a profound fundamental shift in his posture. The crushing, invisible weight he had been carrying on his shoulders for years seemed to have completely evaporated. The moment Sydney saw her husband walk into the room, her default toxic programming reactivated with terrifying speed. She scrambled up from the premium carpet where she had been kneeling among the shredded pieces of her ruined employment contract. Her face was a horrific mask of smeared mascara and furious desperation. She reverted instantly to the only dynamic she understood, which was treating her husband like an emotional punching bag and an unpaid servant. "Terrence," she shrieked, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at me. "Do something right now. Tell her she cannot do this to us. Defend your wife. She is ruining my entire life. She ripped up my executive contract, and she is letting the university expel me. Make her fix it. Tell her we will sue her for every penny she has. You need to protect me." Terrence did not rush to her side. He did not offer a comforting embrace or a single word of blind reassurance. He did not even look at her. He stood perfectly still, letting her frantic, demanding voice wash over him like meaningless background static. He bypassed Harold and Patricia, who were still paralyzed by the reality of their impending suburban bankruptcy. Terrence walked straight toward me, stopping just a few feet away from my bodyguards. He looked me directly in the eye with a level of profound mutual understanding that only two survivors of the exact same toxic family dynamic could truly share. I let the cold, impenetrable mask of the ruthless chief executive officer fall away for a moment. When I looked at Terrence, I did not see an opponent or a collateral casualty of my revenge. I saw a brilliant, dedicated man who had been relentlessly exploited by the exact same people who had tried to destroy me. I saw a dedicated history teacher who had sacrificed his own peace of mind to keep a fundamentally broken marriage afloat. Terrence, I said, my voice shifting into a tone of deep, genuine professional respect. I personally read every single page of that capstone project you submitted under Sydney's name. The predictive financial algorithms you built from scratch were nothing short of spectacular. The way you integrated historical market volatility with real-time economic data models was genuinely visionary. It is exactly the kind of innovative, forward-thinking, analytical capability we aggressively recruit for at my company. Sydney stopped screaming instantly. Her mouth hung open in sheer confusion as she watched me speak to her husband with the profound admiration she had always demanded but never actually earned. She could not comprehend a reality where Terrence's intellect was being praised by a billionaire while she was being discarded as a fraud. Axiom Innovations is currently expanding our global risk assessment division. I continued maintaining absolute steady eye contact with him. We need a lead data analyst who possesses both a masterful grasp of historical trends and the raw technical capability to build complex predictive models. The starting salary for the position is $250,000 a year, along with a comprehensive executive benefits package and immediate stock options. Do you want it? The VIP lounge went completely dead silent again. Patricia let out a loud, strangled gasp. Harold stared at Terrence with wide, terrified eyes, suddenly realizing that the man he had mocked all day as a miserable charity case was about to out-earn his wildest financial dreams. Terrence took a slow, deep breath. The profound exhaustion on his face was instantly replaced by a bright, undeniable spark of absolute validation. For 3 years, he had worked in the dark shadows, completing incredibly complex academic labor, while his wife partied, networked, and took all the credit. Now, the founder of a multi-billion-dollar financial empire was explicitly validating his brilliant mind and offering him a life-changing opportunity based purely on his own authentic merit. I would be deeply honored to accept the position, Terrence replied, his voice steady and completely certain. Thank you, Diana. He then turned slowly to face Sydney. She was trembling violently, staring at him as if he had just transformed into a completely unrecognizable stranger. Terrence. You cannot do this! Sydney whimpered, her arrogant facade finally breaking down into pathetic, desperate panic. You are my husband. You are supposed to take care of me. We are supposed to be a team. You cannot just take a job from the woman who is destroying my life. Terrence looked down at her with an expression of profound pity mixed with absolute emotional detachment. He reached across his body with his right hand and firmly grasped the plain gold wedding band resting on his left ring finger. He did not hesitate for a single second. He slid the warm metal band smoothly off his hand, permanently severing the final physical tie to the woman who had exploited him for years. He walked over to the heavy mahogany table where Harold had just pathetically begged for his financial life. Terrence placed the gold ring firmly onto the polished wood. The metal hit the table with a sharp, definitive clink that echoed through the room with stunning absolute finality. I am filing for divorce tomorrow, Terrence stated, his voice completely devoid of any anger, malice, or regret. He was simply stating a concrete, undeniable fact. Have fun with your parents. He did not wait for her response. He did not look back at Harold or Patricia, who were watching their absolute last potential financial lifeline walk away. Terence turned on his heel and walked straight toward the heavy double doors, his head held high, striding purposefully toward his bright new future. He walked out of the room, completely and entirely free. 3 months passed with the rapid, exhilarating pace of a massive corporate expansion. I stood in the center of my executive suite on the top floor of the Axiom Innovations global headquarters. The panoramic view of the sparkling Chicago skyline stretched out before me, a glittering testament to the financial empire I had built entirely on my own terms. The chaotic, dramatic noise of that graduation day felt like it belonged to a completely different lifetime. My days were no longer defined by the exhausting, agonizing struggle of proving my worth to people who were biologically incapable of seeing it. Instead, my meticulous schedule was packed with high-level board meetings, international expansion strategies, and launching aggressive new financial products that actively disrupted the global banking industry. Terence had seamlessly integrated into the company, stepping into the lead data analyst role with absolute undeniable brilliance. Watching him thrive in an environment that actively rewarded his incredible intellect rather than ruthlessly exploiting it was immensely satisfying. He looked significantly healthier, his eyes sharp and unburdened by the heavy toxic weight of his former marriage. We kept our daily interactions strictly professional, but there was a quiet, steadfast, mutual respect that underscored every analytical report he handed me across the conference table. I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by brilliant innovators who valued competence and fierce integrity above all else. I had forged my own chosen family within these sleek glass walls built entirely on merit and genuine mutual respect, rather than forced biological obligation. Meanwhile, the carefully manicured suburban reality that Harold and Patricia had worshipped far above their own flesh and blood completely disintegrated into ash. The precise financial collapse I had calculated during that VIP lounge confrontation arrived with brutal, absolute certainty. When the massive predatory balloon payment on their second mortgage came due, they had zero capital left to cover it. The bank moved against them with swift, merciless corporate efficiency. Bright neon foreclosure notices were aggressively taped to the custom mahogany front door of their pristine, sprawling estate. The heavily branded moving trucks arrived in broad daylight, stripping the beautiful house of its expensive imported furniture and luxury stainless steel appliances, while the entire neighborhood watched silently from behind their perfectly trimmed hedges. Their social demise was even more catastrophic and immediate than their utter financial ruin. The wealthy country club friends they had spent decades trying to impress desperately abandoned them the very second the vicious rumors of Sydney's public academic fraud and their impending bankruptcy hit the local suburban gossip channels. Richard and Beatrice Belmont, the very people Harold had tried to bribe with my stolen graduation ticket, led the aggressive charge in officially revoking their elite country club membership. My parents were unceremoniously escorted off the pristine golf course grounds by uniformed security, effectively banning them for life from the only social circle they had ever truly cared about. They became absolute, undeniable pariahs in their own wealthy community. The people who had once attended their lavish, catered dinner parties now literally crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with them at the local grocery store. Harold lost the last remaining shreds of his superficial patriarchal dignity, forced to pack his expensive tailored designer suits into cheap cardboard boxes and sell his luxury sedan to clear a fraction of his mounting debt. Patricia watched her entire fabricated identity evaporate into thin air, reduced from a wealthy, arrogant socialite to a bankrupt neighborhood outcast in a matter of a few short weeks. The spectacular, pristine facade they had sacrificed my entire childhood to maintain was utterly dead. The suffocating desperation of their ruin eventually found its way directly to my corporate inbox. Despite strict security protocols filtering my communications, Patricia managed to bypass the firewall, using a relentless string of temporary email addresses. I sat at my massive mahogany desk, sipping a hot espresso, while my monitor illuminated with her frantic, manipulative messages. The subject lines were pathetic attempts at manufacturing emotional guilt. Family is forever Diana. We need you. Please remember your mother. I opened the most recent email, reading the chaotic blocks of text with absolute clinical detachment. Patricia wrote lengthy, dramatic paragraphs begging for immediate family unity. She claimed Harold was suffering from severe stress-induced health issues and could barely afford medication. She pleaded that Sydney was living in a cramped studio apartment, working a grueling minimum-wage retail job, barely able to feed herself. She tried to spin a fictional narrative that they had simply made misguided, innocent mistakes out of pure parental love, and that loyal families stick together during extreme financial hardship. She ended the email by asking for an emergency loan of $500,000 to secure a townhome, promising to pay me back. 5 years ago, reading a message like that from my mother would have triggered a debilitating wave of anxiety and deeply ingrained toxic obligation. I would have agonized over my duty as an obedient daughter, feeling the crushing weight of their expectations bearing down on my chest. But reading her desperate pleading words now, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering anger left in my system. There was no residual sadness or pity. There was only a profound, peaceful emptiness, exactly where my familial attachment used to reside. I looked at the pleading sentences on the glowing screen, recognizing the exact manipulative psychological tactics she had used to break me down when I was vulnerable. She was not reaching out because she loved me or missed me. She was reaching out because her primary financial host had permanently cut the cord, and she was desperately searching for a new, wealthy victim to drain dry. I did not type a single response. I did not send a polite rejection or a venomous warning. I simply moved my cursor over the red delete icon and clicked the mouse button, permanently erasing her pathetic cries for help completely from my secure server. I did not just delete the email. I summoned Oliver into my office and gave him a single directive: contact our lead corporate attorneys immediately. I needed a permanent, ironclad legal barrier constructed between my financial empire and the toxic people trying to claw their way inside. By that afternoon, my legal team drafted an aggressively strict cease and desist order. It explicitly forbade Harold, Patricia, and Sydney from contacting me through any medium, including phone calls, emails, social media, or third-party intermediaries. It legally barred them from coming within 500 feet of any Axiom Innovations property, my private residences, or any corporate events. If they violated a single term, my lawyers were authorized to pursue immediate criminal harassment charges and file for a permanent restraining order. I authorized the document with a swift stroke of my pen, paying a premium to have a private process server hand-deliver the notices directly to their cramped apartment. Narcissists abhor boundaries, viewing restrictions as an insult. I fully anticipated the warning would provoke a desperate act of physical defiance. 3 days later, the internal security alarm on my executive dashboard flashed a bright warning red. Oliver walked briskly into my office, his expression perfectly neutral, but his eyes alert. He informed me that my parents had just breached the main lobby of the Axiom Innovations headquarters. They were causing a massive scene at the front reception desk, aggressively demanding immediate access to the top floor. I simply instructed Oliver to patch the high-definition security camera feeds directly through to my large desktop monitor. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms as the live video feed materialized. The visual was incredibly pathetic. Harold and Patricia were standing in the massive modern lobby of my building, looking entirely out of place. Harold was wearing a poorly fitted suit that looked like it had been pulled from a discount rack, completely lacking his former suburban polish. Patricia looked haggard, her hair unkempt and her posture rigid with frantic entitlement. They were yelling at the lead receptionist, loudly proclaiming that they were the parents of the chief executive officer and demanding the security gates be opened immediately. Patricia even tried to physically push her way past the sleek marble reception desk, attempting to force her way toward the private executive elevators. She did not make it far. I had personally briefed the head of my corporate security detail about the specific threat my family posed. Within seconds, a highly coordinated team of 6 security guards converged on the lobby, moving with swift, tactical precision to form an impenetrable human barricade around Harold and Patricia. I watched through the silent video feed as the head of security stepped directly into Harold's personal space. He pointed toward the heavy glass exit doors, delivering a cold, professional warning. I could see Harold puffing out his chest, attempting to intimidate the guard with his usual aggressive posturing, yelling that he had every right to see his own daughter. The security team did not entertain his delusions for a single second. When Harold refused to turn around, 2 guards firmly grasped him by the elbows, physically turning him toward the exit. Patricia began to scream wildly, swatting at the guards and throwing a massive theatrical temper tantrum right in the middle of the corporate lobby. She clutched her chest, acting as though she was being violently assaulted, but the guards remained perfectly stoic. They professionally and relentlessly marched my parents straight out of the building, pushing them through the revolving glass doors and out onto the busy Chicago pavement. I zoomed in on the external camera feed, watching the final moments of their public humiliation. The head of security stood at the entrance holding up a laminated document, formally reading them their permanent trespass warning. He made it absolutely clear that if they ever stepped foot on Axiom property again, the police would be called, and they would be arrested on the spot. Harold and Patricia stood on the sidewalk looking up at the towering glass skyscraper that belonged entirely to the daughter they had discarded. They looked incredibly small, broken, and utterly powerless. They had finally hit the absolute impenetrable iron wall of my boundaries. They turned and walked away, disappearing into the dense city crowd. I watched them go, feeling nothing but a profound, sweeping wave of total permanent closure. They were banned for life and my fortress was secure. I closed the security feed, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The toxic infection had been successfully excised from my life. I stood up from my desk and decided to walk down to the analytics department, wanting to check on the progress of our latest global risk assessment rollout. As I stepped off the elevator onto the bustling analytics floor, the very first person I saw was Terrence. The visual contrast between his current reality and the miserable, defeated man I had found in the graduation bleachers 3 months ago was absolutely staggering. Terrence was standing at the head of a massive digital conference table, actively leading a team of brilliant data scientists through a complex predictive model presentation. He wore a sharp, perfectly tailored navy suit that highlighted his tall, athletic frame. His posture was straight and commanding, exuding the quiet, natural confidence of a leader whose immense value is recognized and respected. When he saw me observing from the doorway, he paused his presentation and offered me a bright, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He looked incredibly healthy, vibrant, and completely alive. The heavy dark circles that used to haunt his face during his toxic marriage to Sydney were completely gone. He was thriving in an environment that challenged his intellect and rewarded his extreme dedication. Watching Terrence command that room was the absolute ultimate proof I needed. It was the undeniable living evidence that removing toxic narcissistic people from your daily existence does not just bring you peace. It actively breeds phenomenal, unparalleled success. I returned to my penthouse office feeling a profound sense of total closure. The visual of Terrence thriving was the perfect palate cleanser after my parents' pathetic lobby stunt. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk and opened a highly secure encrypted file that Oliver had just deposited into my private inbox. It contained the final comprehensive background update on my estranged sister. I read the detailed report with the same cold, analytical precision I used to evaluate a failing corporate acquisition. Sydney had completely flatlined. Her spectacular public expulsion from the university had effectively rendered her entirely unemployable in the corporate sector. Word travels at lightning speed in the financial world. Every major human resources department in the city had placed her name on their permanent do not hire lists. Without her fraudulent degree and without the prestigious Axiom Innovations title she had so arrogantly bragged about, Sydney was stripped of every single credential she claimed to possess. But her professional destruction was only a fraction of her nightmare. The real devastating blow came from the total loss of her primary financial host. For years, Sydney had viciously mocked Terrence for his high school history teacher salary, treating his hard-earned paycheck as her own personal slush fund. Now that reliable income stream was completely severed, leaving her drowning in the massive credit card debt she had recklessly accumulated, trying to maintain a wealthy facade. The most incredibly satisfying detail of the report, however, was the stunning poetic justice of her ongoing divorce proceedings. When Sydney and Terrence first got married, Harold and Patricia had heavily intervened. They convinced Sydney that she was a brilliant prodigy destined for boundless corporate wealth, while Terrence was destined to remain a financially irrelevant public servant. Driven by her insatiable greed and monumental arrogance, Sydney had forced Terrence to sign an incredibly strict ironclad prenuptial agreement. The legal document was viciously one-sided. It explicitly stated that in the event of a divorce, all assets, debts, and future earnings would remain completely separate. It contained a brutal waiver of any right to spousal support or alimony. Sydney had demanded that specific contract to ensure Terrence could never touch her imaginary millions. But karma has a spectacular sense of humor. That exact same predatory legal document had just backfired on her with devastating absolute precision. Because of her own unyielding greed, Sydney walked into the divorce court and discovered she had legally locked herself out of the greatest financial windfall of her life. Terrence was now earning a massive $250,000 base salary plus highly lucrative executive stock options at my company. Thanks to the ironclad prenup, Sydney was legally barred from touching a single solitary cent of his new Axiom wealth. She walked out of the courtroom with absolutely zero spousal support, no assets, and sole responsibility for her staggering personal debt. She had built her own financial cage and locked herself inside it. The report concluded with a stark description of Sydney's current daily reality. The golden child had officially lost all her gold. Stripped of her luxury lifestyle and completely cut off from my parents' bankrupted accounts, Sydney had no choice but to enter the actual workforce. She was currently employed at a massive discount retail chain, working grueling, unpredictable minimum wage shifts. The woman who had proudly strutted down the graduation aisle wearing a fake valedictorian sash was now spending 8 hours a day standing on hard linoleum floors, folding discounted sweaters, and dealing with highly aggressive bargain hunters. She wore a cheap, scratchy polyester uniform and a plastic name tag, a massive, humiliating downgrade from the tailored designer blazers she had aggressively purchased for her imaginary executive role. Her days were now strictly governed by a time clock and a demanding retail manager who did not care at all about her fabricated suburban pedigree. But the humiliation did not end when she clocked out of her miserable retail job. Because Harold and Patricia had lost their sprawling, pristine suburban estate, the three of them had been forced to pool their non-existent resources just to survive. They were currently crammed into a tiny, incredibly run-down two-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable, noisy neighborhood far outside the city limits. The mental image of that living situation was intensely fascinating. Three highly toxic, raging narcissists were now permanently trapped inside a claustrophobic, cheap apartment together. There was no more country club to escape to. There were no more luxury vacations to distract them. There was no invisible daughter left to act as their emotional punching bag. They were completely stuck with each other, forced to stare at the undeniable physical evidence of their colossal failures every single day. I imagined her coming home from a brutal shift, her feet aching and her pride completely shattered, only to open the door to a tiny living room filled with her parents' toxic complaints. They would bicker over the grocery bill. They would fight over the utility costs. They would constantly remind each other of the catastrophic mistakes that led them to this miserable existence. Without my money to steal, and without my success to falsely claim as their own, they had absolutely nothing left to bond over. The golden child was now just another broke retail worker struggling to pay the rent, and her parents were just two disgraced outcasts hiding from the world. The poetic justice of their situation was absolutely flawless. I closed the digital file and securely locked my computer terminal. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy for their pathetic living conditions. They had earned every ounce of their current misery through decades of unchecked cruelty and bottomless greed. The universe had simply balanced the scales, and I was finally free to enjoy the immense, profound peace of a life completely cleansed of their presence. I stood up from my massive mahogany desk and walked out of my executive office, leaving the corporate headquarters behind for the day. My private driver was waiting in the secure underground parking garage to take me home. The ride through the bustling Chicago streets felt completely different this evening. The vibrant city lights blurred past the tinted windows of my luxury sedan, reflecting the profound, absolute clarity I finally possessed. When the private elevator doors opened directly into my penthouse, I stepped out into a space that was entirely my own. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the entire expanse of the main living room, offering an absolutely breathtaking panoramic view of the magnificent city skyline. I poured myself a glass of expensive sparkling water and walked over to the thick, reinforced glass, resting my hand gently against the cool, smooth surface. Down below, millions of tiny glowing lights twinkled in the encroaching darkness, representing millions of complex lives happening simultaneously. I stood there suspended high above the chaotic noise of the busy streets, breathing in the absolute flawless silence of my personal sanctuary. The penthouse was immaculate, decorated exactly to my specific high-end tastes, and completely devoid of any compromising clutter. Every piece of custom furniture, every piece of striking modern art, every square inch of this sprawling estate had been purchased with money I earned through my own relentless grit. The contrast between my current reality and the miserable, cramped apartment my parents were now permanently confined to was absolutely staggering. They were trapped in a tiny prison of their own making, surrounded by the loud, aggressive noises of a failing neighborhood and the bitter, constant sting of their monumental regrets. Meanwhile, I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of luxury, breathing in the crisp, filtered air of a home I owned outright. There were no strings attached to this place. There were no heavy, toxic obligations lurking in the shadows. There was nobody waiting in the next room to tell me I lacked potential or that I was a fundamental disappointment. It was a flawless fortress of pure, unadulterated peace. Looking out over the glittering metropolis, I took a long moment to deeply reflect on the agonizing, grueling journey that had finally brought me to this exact physical and emotional elevation. When you are raised in a deeply toxic environment, you are aggressively conditioned to believe that your worth is a fluctuating currency. You are taught from a very young age that love is a strict transactional commodity doled out only when you perfectly fit into a rigid, acceptable mold. For 32 years, I had exhausted myself trying to purchase my parents' affection with good behavior, quiet obedience, and desperate, frantic attempts to prove my basic value. I used to think that achieving massive financial success would be the ultimate magic key to finally unlocking their genuine approval. I used to believe that if I could just build something big enough and impressive enough, they would look at me the exact same way they looked at Sydney. But standing here tonight, wrapped in the exquisite, healing silence of my penthouse, I finally understood the absolute truth. Success is not just about accumulating an astronomical amount of money. The billions sitting securely in my corporate accounts, the soaring executive stock options, the global prestige, those are just the external, visible byproducts of my ambition. True, profound success is the overwhelming, impenetrable peace that comes from permanently severing ties with people who only value you conditionally. True wealth is waking up every single morning and knowing with absolute certainty that you do not have to perform for anyone who actively roots for your failure. I did not need to buy their love because their love was fundamentally bankrupt. It was an incredibly poor emotional investment, and I had finally closed the account for good. My mind drifted back to that terrible Tuesday morning 5 years ago. I thought about Harold aggressively ripping my hard-earned acceptance letter straight down the middle, throwing my dreams directly into the kitchen trash can without a second thought. I thought about Patricia looking at me with pure, unadulterated contempt, sneering that investing in my education was throwing money out the window. I thought about Sydney smirking from the doorway, entirely convinced that her unearned golden child status would carry her through life without a single consequence. In that moment of profound devastation, I thought they had completely destroyed me. I thought they had stripped away every last ounce of my dignity, leaving me with absolutely nothing. But as I watched the vibrant city lights reflect off the cool glass of my penthouse window, I realized the absolute brilliant irony of their cruelty. Their vicious rejection was actually the single greatest gift they ever could have given me. By throwing me out into the cold and completely cutting off their financial and emotional support, they accidentally handed me the exact tools I needed to conquer the corporate world. They forced me to learn how to survive entirely on my own terms. They forced me to dig deep into my own soul and discover a well of relentless burning ambition that they never could have comprehended. Their abuse did not break me. It forged me under immense, unimaginable pressure until I became entirely unbreakable. If they had paid for my tuition, I would have been forever indebted to their toxic manipulation. If they had shown me conditional kindness, I would have remained trapped in their miserable suburban facade forever. By offering me absolutely nothing, they left me with no other choice but to go out and take absolutely everything. I was no longer the invisible daughter cowering in the shadows. I was the powerful architect of my own magnificent destiny. I turned away from the sprawling city skyline and looked directly out at you. Yes, you. The person watching this story, who might be sitting in a dark room right now, feeling completely crushed by the heavy weight of a toxic family. The person who is constantly told that they are not good enough, smart enough, or valuable enough to deserve genuine unconditional love. I want you to look at my journey and realize that your current situation is not your permanent destination. You have an incredible, massive reservoir of untapped power waiting to be unleashed the very second you decide to stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You can build your own empire from the ground up, and you do not need their permission to do it. Success is the best revenge, but silence is the ultimate power. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about taking back your power. The story of Diana's rise from a dismissed daughter to an unstoppable CEO highlights a profound and empowering lesson. Your true worth is never defined by the conditional approval of others, even if those people are your own family. From a young age, society often conditions us to believe that family loyalty should be absolute, even when it comes at the expense of our own mental and emotional well-being. Diana's parents constantly measured her value through a distorted, toxic lens, actively trying to tear her down just to prop up a superficial, suburban facade. However, the most crucial takeaway from her journey is that painful rejection can actually serve as the ultimate catalyst for growth. When conditional support is completely removed, we are forced to discover our own profound resilience. By withdrawing their help and dismissing her dreams, Diana's family accidentally handed her the exact motivation she needed to become self-sufficient and completely unbreakable. Furthermore, this narrative redefines what it means to be genuinely wealthy. True success is not merely about accumulating a massive fortune, holding a high-level executive title, or publicly proving your doubters wrong. Real success is the impenetrable peace that comes from establishing firm boundaries and severing ties with those who continually undermine your potential. Diana realized that she did not need to earn her family's love because their love was fundamentally bankrupt. Instead, she chose to build a life and a chosen circle based on authentic respect, integrity, and merit. Ultimately, we are the sole architects of our own destinies, and we hold the power to dictate who gets a seat at our table. Take a moment today to evaluate the boundaries in your own life and find the courage to distance yourself from anyone who makes you feel like you aren't enough.